Hi, everyone. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane.
Welcome to the Musical Innertube, the podcast born out of a mistake.
We once meant to introduce a soothing musical interlude, but we said soothing musical inner tube, and the name stuck.
On this podcast, we talk to interesting people about their interesting lives, jobs, hobbies, and passions.
Difference makers who really make a difference.
Today, we welcome back to the Musical Innertube a friend of the podcast, Jennifer Lin. She was a very accomplished correspondent and reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer for 31 years, and her postings there included Beijing, New York, and Washington, D.C., and these days, Jennifer is an author and a filmmaker. And she's here today to talk about her latest documentary titled 10 Times Better. It's about George Lee, who became the first Asian dancer on Broadway and almost everywhere else he went. A child dance prodigy who grew up poor in Shanghai. A refugee fleeing war, George was selected as a teenager by George Balanchine to dance in his original staging of the Nutcracker. He was recognized, but no less than Gene Kelly, who cast him in the original production of Flower, Drum Song. Jennifer has been showing 10 Times Better to audiences all over the country. So let's find out what people think about George and his wonderful story. Welcome back, Jennifer.
Well, thanks, John and Don, for having me back.
Great to have you.
It really is. And exciting, too. Watching the movie, I'm reminded, because I got a chance to see a slightly different version as Don did 6 months ago. I'm reminded of the personality of George, that he is bigger than life still today at 89. Such an amazing story, of course, almost tells itself once you have all the visuals in place. Did you find that too, that his personality is part of what really makes this movie go?
Absolutely. That's the thing that really draws people in. It's not only that he had this amazing journey as a dancer, but people just really respond well to George himself. He's endearing. My producing partner, John Funabiki, this is his first movie that he's been involved in. I told John, I said, John, we caught a unicorn here. I mean, it's just such a perfect little tale. And so, again, it's not only what George did as a dancer, but the fact that he's such a humble person. And he's just very kind of happy with, he's not bitter. And I think that really comes through.
I mean, he could have been bitter, couldn't he?
Absolutely.
He does acknowledge that many of the places that he went wouldn't deal with Asians. Many times he'd go on Broadway, and of course, like everybody else does, he auditions and auditions and auditions, and they would keep him until the very end and finally say something like, well, you're too short. And the typecasting, he does acknowledge that sometimes hurt. But you're right, the bitterness, he's left that behind if he ever had it. I don't think, looking at George, the happy-go-luckiness, I don't think he was ever bitter.
Yeah, and I think one of the messages that comes through, or one of the themes, is resilience, and how that has served him well in life too. So, yeah, I mean, we're taking it on the road now, the movie, and we're starting to show it mostly at film festivals. But it's so interesting to hear people's responses. So we had a screening in Las Vegas in May, which is George's hometown, and in the beautiful Beverly Theater, which is a brand new art house in the arts district of Las Vegas. And, one of the people who came to the screening was the CEO of Wynn Casino. And he came with his wife, and, they supported the film and catered the event. And afterwards, this CEO, his name is Craig Billings, he talked to George. And he told George, he goes, I grew up in Vegas. He said, I'm the only son of a single mom. And your story and the resilience that you showed in your life really resonated with me. So I think it hits people on a lot of different levels. For Asian Americans, of course, it resonates because it's really lost history that we've excavated here. But then again, it's just George and his resiliency and his kind of positive outlook on life that I think also has an effect on audiences.
It's interesting, too, because if you just listen to that cursory summary of George's life, you would think maybe, and again, it's stereotyping, but people have the idea of the dragon mom. But it's interesting because George's mom was Polish.
Right.
And his father was Chinese.
Right.
But the Polish mother, and I was married to a Polish woman for a number of years, or a woman of Polish descent. And I will say that the Polish are equally able to be dragon moms. But he had a very good relationship with his mother. And a lot of what he did was to please his mother and make her happy. On the other hand, she really put him in through the drills of being a good dancer, and he really, really paid off at the end with that.
She was the quintessential dance mom / tiger mom. And that's the type of overbearing person that, you could as a child grow up to resent. But to the opposite, George in the film, he kind of tears up when he recalls his mother. And I think that's a really poignant moment of the film. For George and his mother, it wasn't just dance because dance was a beautiful art form and she was good at it and he was good at it. No, it was survival. When they were in Shanghai, he was just a boy and she had him dancing at nightclubs. They were paid sometimes during the war years in rice. When they got to New York, it was very much about survival. And his turn to Broadway came after disappointment in ballet, not getting hired by the New York City Ballet or the American Ballet Theater, but he turned to Broadway because they needed to have a paycheck. And so that it was so lucky for him that just as he was searching for work, Rodgers and Hammerstein were also searching for dancers and actors for Flower Drum Song, which was like full employment for 3 years plus for George. So again, like there was, he and mom were very close and dance was a way for them to survive. And there's no bitterness. George just feels nothing but admiration for his mother for pushing him. And that's what I tell my daughter, Dawn, that, the reason I push her and the reason I was a tiger mom was just for her to do well.
It's good to mention because, of course, one of the main things is that George looks Asian, is Asian. He talks about looking different from everybody else. He knew that when he was walking around. There was one place where he said, "Oh, no colors." Well, of course, I can't go in there because I'm colored.
Yeah.
And the other side of him, though, is pretty European. He's got that injection of the great Russian tradition. And he even says that. He says, my training, my way of thinking about dancing was the Russian way where you have to do everything perfect. No excuses. And his mother was quite a teacher. Every time she saw him slightly slumped over his cereal, she would slap him or something. She'd give him a tap on the shoulder in no unmistakable fashion. So there's he is a mixture, which he does acknowledge also, is that, he had the Russian part and he learned English and, of course, the Chinese part.
Well, a very interesting point, John, that didn't come out in the movie, but came out in our conversations with George, is that he grew up in Shanghai in the 1930s, 1940s. And Shanghai back then was a very international city. And his mother was very close with a lot of the Eastern Europeans, the Russians. They lived in the old French concession of Shanghai. And his mother observed how the Europeans treated the native Chinese, and not with a lot of respect. Mm-hmm. And so when they were in the refugee camp heading to New York City, George's mother had a very, frank conversation with him saying, "George, all they're going to see is your face. And George looks very Chinese." And she said, "They're going to treat you like a Chinese person. So that's why you have to be 10 times better, because you're going to white America and they treat people of color differently." Kind of a very relevant topic these days, but he was mixed race. And, he did know that when he got to the United States, people would just see him as a Chinese man. And his Polish mother taught him that lesson from a very young age. So I have to believe that Shanghai had something to do with it.
Yeah, the international mixture in Shanghai. How did you come upon George's story in the beginning in order to tell it? How did you get introduced to George and that remarkable story?
I discovered George in the library, and I was doing my research at the New York Public Library on the Nutcracker. I wanted to see, what I could learn about the New York City Ballet's premier That's really the gold standard Nutcracker in America, and that came out in 1954. The genius George Balanchine choreographed it. So I was looking at the files, Don, and I saw the publicity photos, and there was this picture of a young Chinese man doing the tea role. And I was looking at it, and I was like, "Who is this?" And I didn't realize that in 1954, the New York City Ballet had any dancers of color. So I just became intrigued by this dancer named George Lee. I remember precisely when this was. It was November 2022. And in fact, I was waiting to go see the Nutcracker with my daughter across Lincoln Center. And so I had a few hours to kill, and I was at the New York Public Library. So I was like, who is George Lee and why don't I know about him? So I just, I've been a reporter my whole life. So I just put on my reporter's hat and I said, well, I need to talk to him because I couldn't find any other records on him and no evidence that he ever appeared again with the New York City Ballet. And he had gotten rave reviews for his performance in the Nutcracker. So it took me about 5 weeks, but I finally tracked him down. And I'll this is a story in and of itself, but, I kind of hit a dead end trying to find him because George Lee is a very common name. And there are a lot of George Lees in the world, and I just couldn't find him. So Phil Chan, who is an Asian American dance producer in New York City, he introduced me to a woman named Arlene Yu. And Arlene used to work at the New York Public Library, and she too was looking for George Lee for the same reason I was. Like, who was this man who was dancing for Balanchine back in the 1950s? So we exchanged emails, and I shared with her everything I knew, and she shared with me everything she knew. And again, Don, I had hit a dead end in trying to track down George Lee. But she gave me the key to unlock the mystery. She sent me a one-sentence brief that had been in Variety newspaper that she had found. And it said simply that George Lee, it was from 1959, and it said George Lee became a U.S. citizen today. And so it's like, aha, so he was an immigrant. So with that, I was able to track down his naturalization papers on Ancestry.com. And it gave me his date of birth. And it also said that on this day that he became a U.S. citizen, he changed his name from L.I. to L.E.E. So I, went back to newspapers.com and Ancestry.com. I found the ship manifest when he came to the United States by boat in 1951. And on it, it mentions how George was 15 and he was traveling with his mother, Stanislava Lee, which is a very unusual name. And so I put that into newspapers.com and I found her obituary. And it says she survived by one son, George, who lives in Las Vegas. So, I used one of those websites called truthfinder.com. I took out a trial subscription for a week and I plugged in his name in Las Vegas, came up with 5 phone numbers. The first 4 that I called, I got this number is no longer in service. The 5th number I put in and I got, please leave a message. So I left a rambling message saying, I'm a filmmaker from Philadelphia. I'm looking for George Lee. George Lee, the ballet dancer. He danced for George Balanchine in the Nutcracker, yada, 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 yada. And soon after, I got a phone call from this man who said, I'm George Lee. And I said, George Lee, the ballet dancer? And he goes, yes, I'm George Lee, the ballet dancer. He goes, why are you looking for me? I'm nobody. And Don, that just resonated with me because, he told me his life story. And after I hung up the phone, I called my producing partner, John Funabiki. I said, we have got to do a story about this man. It is an unbelievable, epic tale. And he also has a great story to tell about ballet and Broadway. So if you'll indulge me for a minute here, fast forward to February. We had our premiere at Film at Lincoln Center. And the New York Times, a week before the premiere, did a profile of us and George and the making of the film. And they ran it on a Sunday. Not a bad time to run in the New York Times. And so that Wednesday, the New York Public Library and a group in New York called Works and Process, which does programming around dance, they held a special event for us where we could talk about using the archives to tell our story and how we found George at the library, and basically how we built this documentary, because we did rely on the New York Public Library for a lot of photos and vintage footage. And Works in Process flew George out to New York. It was the first time he had been in New York City since 1993.
Wow.
So now the man who told me when I first reached out to me, I'm nobody. I have to tell you, that Wednesday at the event at the New York Public Library, because of the New York Times, the 200-seat auditorium was filled, so much so that they had, auxiliary seating in the lobby for another 40 people. Wow. And in the audience was the president of the New York City Ballet, the artistic director of the New York City Ballet, and the head of the School of American Ballet. And when George, this nobody, when he walked out on stage, they didn't even say his name, and everyone stood up and applauded. And wow. To me, that's been like the most memorable moment of this whole incredible journey. Like, George got his due. And the New York City Ballet invited him to a production and had him backstage so he could stand on the magnificent stage there at Lincoln Center. And the School of American Ballet invited him to come to the school. And we went, we observed a class being taught, and George got his picture taken. And, the New York Public Library did an oral history of George. So it's just been such an amazing journey for me as a journalist. I've never really experienced anything like this. So it's been remarkable. And, George is getting his due. This is long overdue, but people are now realizing he was a pioneer. He did contribute something. He was a first. So it's been really wonderful.
Well, your story shows us that you still have journalist chops and that you use them exactly the right way. People who don't have your experience, I think, as a journalist might have been at loose ends, but you followed it on the merest of trails. That's just great. I'm wondering.
I also think probably, there may be a job waiting for you on finding your roots on that PBS show, because you did a heck of a job there.
Yeah, right. Or I should get hired by Ancestry.com, because I do really rely on them to track him down. It's a remarkable resource.
What are you finding on the cinematic trail as you show this movie around in different communities? What questions are they asking? What are they telling you?
It's been really interesting. We've screened the film now in Las Vegas, LA, San Francisco. We're going back to LA in September. We're also going back to San Francisco. We're doing a special screening too with the Oakland Ballet. One of our advisors is the head of the Oakland Ballet, so they're doing a screening for us. What I'm finding is just the overwhelmingly positive response of audiences to George and his story. And George is really, a man of few words is sometimes when he's before a big audience like that. I think he's kind of still overwhelmed by the reaction. But, I've done quite a few private screenings with affinity groups at corporations. These are known as employee resource groups. And those have been very interesting because, a lot of people who I've spoken to who are Asian Americans, the whole messaging of having to be 10 times better really resonates with a lot of immigrant groups, not just Asian Americans. But frankly, to be honest with you, I think it's a message that resonates with just a lot of people. Women have felt that need to be 10 times better. And so, I think people respond to the messaging of the film. And they're also taken by George and his clear closeness still to his mother and how she really shaped who he is. And I think a lot of people relate to that. So it's been really very heartwarming. So we've had, quite a few screenings, and we hope to have a lot more. We have it on the film festival circuit, so fingers crossed that we get into more festivals, and we should be finding out soon. But yeah, so it's been quite a positive reaction.
You mentioned John Funabiki. Do you want to talk a little bit about your production company? Because you're Jennifer Lin, and we haven't had anybody else in front of the mic, but I'd love you to talk about the group that's making these movies with you.
Well, it's a very, very small group, a skeleton group of filmmakers. The producers of both 10 Times Better and my current project, which is called Beyond Yellowface, are my daughter, Corey Stieg, who is a former ballet dancer herself, and John Funabiki, who is a longtime friend of mine. John and I met like 40 years ago when we were both much younger journalists, both covering Asia for our respective newspapers. Myself for the Philadelphia Inquirer and John for the paper in San Diego. And that's how we met. We met at the East West Center in Hawaii, and we were doing a fellowship there. So John has a background in writing about Asian American issues, and he also has a background in philanthropy. He was with the Ford Foundation. So I reached out to him when we were starting work on Beyond Yellowface, and I said, "Hey, John, how would you like to produce a movie?" And he said yes, which is great. His granddaughter is a dancer, so we like to joke that he's a dance grandpa. And I'm the dance mom, and Corey is the dancer. And so the three of us have been really steering the ship, Beyond Yellowface and then 10 Times Better. And, I work with the same cinematographer and same editor from my previous project, which was Beethoven in Beijing. And the DP is Paul Van Hout, and my editor is Rachel Sophia Stewart. And so that's essentially the team, John. We are a tight group. But the wonderful thing about filmmaking today is the way into it is less of a problem than it would have been like 15, 20 years ago.
We'll be back to our podcast in just a moment. But first, here is a soothing musical interlude.
Jennifer Lin is a filmmaker, writer, and journalist living near Philadelphia. For 31 years, she worked as a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, reporting on events in China, Taiwan, Indonesia, and throughout the Asian world.
But she soon realized that the story she wanted to tell was that of her own Chinese family, which had converted to Christianity in the 1800s and endured persecution and hardship to come to the United States. The result was her first book, Shanghai Faithful.
Her documentary, Beethoven in Beijing, tells the story of the Philadelphia Orchestra's 1973 visit to China, bringing not only Western music, but also a new relationship between China and the United States, and a China-wide obsession with Beethoven.
Beethoven in Beijing debuted on PBS in 2021. Jennifer also wrote the accompanying book. Among her recent work is a finished film, 10 Times Better, and also Beyond Yellowface, now in post-production.
For more on Jennifer, check out her website, jenniferlinmedia.com. That's Jennifer, L-I-N, media.com. Beethoven in Beijing is available on PBS Passport under Great Performances. For more on 10 Times Better, check out 10timesbetterfilm.com. And for more on Beyond Yellowface, check out beyondyellowface.com.
And now we return you to the Musical Innertube, already in progress.
I'm wondering, too, and this may tie into this next project, Beyond Yellowface, but when George is asked why he didn't get into the ballet theater in New York, he says they told him he was too short. And he is a diminutive man now, probably more than when he was younger, but still he's not a very tall guy. He's not 6 feet. But I'm wondering, as I'm watching the show, if that might have been sort of a way to let him down easy, in the sense that when he went to Broadway, he was needed for Flower Drum Song because that was all Asian performers, or as many Asian performers as they could get. But again, his time in Broadway trailed off after a while, And I'm thinking maybe, it was a time when there wasn't that idea of inclusion, and Asian dancers weren't, there's plenty of white dancers. Why do we need an Asian dancer?
I think
That sort of attitude.
Yeah, I think today he could have found work as a ballet dancer with a ballet company. I think the understanding of what makes the perfect dancer is much broader today than it was in 1954. And in 1954, the ideal for a male dancer at the level of the New York City Ballet, or the precursor to American Ballet Theater, was a very tall, typically Caucasian man. And George could look around and see that everyone that American Ballet Theater was hiring tended to be kind of Nordic types who were much taller. So, George is of another generation, and I find this to be, pretty common among his generation, where he didn't see it as an Asian thing. He saw it as height. But when he went to Broadway, he did get work. He got work in Flower Drum Song, which was all about the Asian American experience. Hal Prince, the great director, hired him for Baker Street, and he played the role of the Chinese coolie. He got hired in Annie Get Your Gun and played the role of the Chinese cook. So do you see a pattern there? There's
very much so, yes.
A bit of typecasting. And when he would go to these cattle calls for other musicals, and they would tell him, well, George, you're not the type. Well, what does that mean? You're too short, or you're not, quote, the type. So I think George, had to battle, barriers that were placed before Asian American dancers that weren't placed before others. So it was an issue, but it's not something I think that he focused on. And I think to this day, he probably wouldn't say, oh, well, there was a racial issue there. I think he would say, oh, I was too short. And he was on the short side, but there are dancers his size who are with ballet companies, top ballet companies. I had one dancer who engaged in a conversation with me after seeing the film, and he was on the shorter side. And he said, there's always a role for short dancers. I mean, there's certain characters like Puck in A Midsummer's Night Dream, where you need a short dancer. We all don't have to be 6 feet tall. So, but that wasn't really an option for him back in the 1950s.
That's not the way that producers and casters were thinking.
Right.
Certainly. Beyond Yellowface is a sort of a much larger movie. It doesn't focus only on one dancer. It really focuses on a topic, which is the treatment of Asian people in a major medium. You want to talk a little bit about that? I hear that it's in post-production.
Yes, it is. And really 10 Times Better and Beyond Yellowface are bookends, where 10 Times Better looks at an Asian American pioneer in dance, so the past. And Beyond Yellowface really looks at the present and the future of dance when it comes to Asian Americans. And so the Beyond Yellowface, it focuses on 2 dancers of Asian descent in New York City, Phil Chan and Georgina Paskogan. And they started the final bell for Yellowface movement, which is really challenging the ballet world to do better, both in terms of the stories they tell and representation among dancers and choreographers. And specifically, one of the first things they did when they were started about 5-6 years ago was to look at ballet stories, starting with the Nutcracker. The Nutcracker is the entry ballet for everyone. There are hundreds and hundreds of productions of the Nutcracker every Christmas. And so the Chinese dance has been problematic. Usually the depiction of the Chinese dancers kind of falls into racial tropes of, the long queue, the pointy fingers.
Oh, gosh, yes.
Yeah. And so they actually, it's very an interesting story, and this is in the movie, but Phil Chan and Georgina Paskogan had gotten a call from Peter Martins, who at the time was the artistic director of the New York City Ballet. And Peter Martins basically could not ignore the fact that a lot of people had written into the New York City Ballet saying, I don't feel comfortable with the depiction of the Chinese dancers in your version of the Nutcracker. So Martins had Phil talk to him and advise him and actually made changes in the costuming and the little bit of the gesturing in that dance, toning it down a bit. And so, Phil and Gina looked around at other dance companies and said, there are a lot of dance companies whose depiction of the Chinese dance is really, insulting. And so they started the Final Bow for Yellowface movement, which is basically a pledge saying, I'll no longer do yellowface on stage and I will deal with the racial tropes in ballet. And they have gotten hundreds of people to sign this pledge, including many of the top ballet companies. But they've gone beyond just looking at the Chinese dance, which is basically 70 seconds of choreography. And Phil has looked at an entire ballet that's very problematic called La Bayadere. It was created more than 100 years ago, by a choreographer named Petipa, who also did like Swan Lake and a lot of big ballets. And it's set in an Indian temple, and there's nothing Indian about it. It's like sprang from his imagination. But there are things about it that are problematic. For instance, performing in blackface. And some of the temple characters are basically men with wild hair and loincloths and darkened skin, kind of crawling around the temple. And a lot of people have said, you know what, we're not comfortable with this. So what Phil did is like, why can't we take the story, keep the choreography, keep the music, but let's take the story out of the temple and put it in another setting. And he chose a Hollywood studio in the 1930s, and they're filming a cowboy musical. And so they performed this new production in March at Indiana University, which has a real top flight ballet program. It's one of the best in the country. And we filmed it, and it was delightful. And, minus all the offensive things like blackface and kind of an insulting portrayal of Indian people. So there a lot of folks embrace what they're doing and a lot of people don't. But what they're doing is they're raising a topic in the rarefied world of ballet and saying, we should stop and think about what we portray on stages. And there should be more representation, and there should be an absence of racial tropes in these classical works. So it's a provocative film, and hopefully we'll finish it in time for it to appear in festivals next year.
I would think, too, also, that it shows a way. The thing that comes to mind, and it's kind of very weird, but the thing that comes to mind is when I went out and bought a bunch of DVDs of old Warner Brothers cartoons. And they felt the need to have Whoopi Goldberg do a little intro on it that said, look, these were made in the 1940s, and Black people are not portrayed very well in there, and neither are Asian people. There are war movies in there where Asians are the villains. But that was then, and this is now, and we just want to let you know we're going to run it anyway, but you have to keep that in mind. With dance, that's such a fluid thing that you can do what they did to change a racist temple into a cowboy thing. In other words, you can change the setting, you can change the costuming, but keep the choreography. And that just seems like a wonderful way to update something without having to rip the life out of it or rip the guts out of it.
You would think done, but there is a rigidity in the ballet world to change. And so like with La Bayadere, that came out in the 1800s when not a lot of people went to India. They right. didn't know what it was about. They would read about it because the Prince of Wales went to India in 1875, and that was big news, and everyone in Europe was reading about it. But no one had traveled there. Few people had. Well, okay, today we know what India is like. A lot of people go there. We know what China is like. So why would you fall back on kind of this Orientalist fantasy when you could like make it more realistic or put it in a different setting? But there is this is one of the classical arts, ballet, and there is a certain rigidity from straying from what was. And so they're kind of like nudging the ballet world to just ask questions. And as the woman who runs the ballet department at Indiana University says, they're not saying don't do Bayadere, but why not try a different way of doing it? Why not experiment? And so it's a bold experiment. I frankly think it works. Viewers will be able to decide for themselves, but it's kind of a happy change. It was very interesting, Don, to talk to like the young dancers, the young university students who were in it. And the one dancer I spoke to was of South Asian descent, and she was like, I used to do traditional Indian dance, as a youngster. And when you look at the old La Bayadere, there's nothing Indian about it. So, there's that. And there was one Black dancer who said, I know it's not personal, but when I see these old films of Bayadere where the dancers are in blackface, it feels a little personal. And so, there's no need to do that, certainly. But Sarah Roth, the woman who runs the ballet department, she said that, when she was a professional dancer, she had to paint her body brown to do La Bayadere. And she said she didn't ask questions, but there's no reason today not to ask questions like, why are we doing this? So yellowface, is a lot like blackface. I should have said that at the outset because not a lot of people know what the term means. So like when Georgina Paskogan, who's the other character in Beyond Yellowface, the first time she did the Chinese dance in the Nutcracker for the New York City Ballet, she had to put on yellow makeup to accentuate her already Asian features. So it's like we don't have to do that today. It's also interesting. One of the scenes in the film is at the Wilmington Ballet, and the artistic director, they were doing the Nutcracker, and they invited Gina down to do the Sugar Plum role, and he told me he's African American, and he said when he was a kid growing up in ballet and doing the Chinese dance, he had to put on whiteface. And he said, thinking back on it now, I'm horrified. But that was just like the time. So we are evolving as a society. Can't ballet evolve too?
Sure. Things are changing glacially. And it just seems that it's hard to be in the middle of change, especially when change is never done. Do you feel that? Because I know that you yourself, part of your connection to these topics is that you are from a family story which includes China and includes, but also, many people would be surprised to know, Christianity, because a great-great-grandfather of yours, I think, or maybe great-great-great, converted in the 19th century. I can't remember how many greats in front of the grandfather.
Yeah. So, John, my father was from Shanghai, and he was part of the great diaspora of people who fled China in 1949 after the end of the Civil War there and came to the United States. He was in medical school, so he did all of his medical training then in first in Atlantic City, then in Hartford, Connecticut, and finally in Philadelphia, where he was working at Temple Hospital and met my mother, an Italian-American nurse from Camden, New Jersey, and the rest is history. But yeah, I mean, I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I didn't live in Chinatown. My father was a busy surgeon. My mother raised us. So my kind of connection with my Asian heritage really evolved as I grew older. Again, a very kind of hot topic these days, racial identity. And I, really started exploring my Asian heritage in 1979. I can actually pinpoint it when my father took me and two of my sisters to Shanghai to meet the family he left behind. His parents had passed away by then, but he had a brother and a sister who were still living in the family home. So I got to stay in the family home, meet these relatives who had just been kind of names in letters that we got every month from Shanghai, and really kind of see the world where my father grew up, and learning in that trip in 1979 that their lives were hell-ish for many many years. And I also learned that one of the reasons was this uncle of mine who was one of the leading Christian voices of the 20th century, a man by the name of Watchman Nee. And during the communist era in China, he was immediately arrested and sent to a labor camp and labeled, an enemy of the people. So if you're related to an enemy of the people, you too are an enemy of the people. And so for the family, the Lin family, the Cultural Revolution was really a horrible time. So, I'm 19 years old. I'm in China for the first time learning all this. And it's like, wait, what? And it's like, so for me, that was kind of the seminal moment. That was the turning point where I'm like, okay, kind of, I grew up in America in the 1960s and 70s. And, the Vietnam War was constantly playing in the background, right? And you wanted nothing more than just to be, quote, all American. But then I'm in China. It's like, wait a second, this is where I come from. I mean, it sounds trite, but it's like that started this whole lifelong journey for me of trying to find out like what my family was all about. And that led me to writing a book, Shanghai Faithful, which is a family memoir. And I go all the way back to the beginning to my great-grandfather, who was a fisherman in Fujian province who became the first convert to Christianity. And so like the trajectory of my family over 5 generations is really the story of modern China, but through the eyes of a family that was Christian and by virtue of that had really tight, close connection with Westerners. And so it's an interesting way of looking at Chinese history, again, over the last 150 years. And so that took me 40 years to report and write. But, I finally came out with that book almost 10 years ago. And that really, again, it was kind of an awakening, John. And as a teenager, I didn't grow up with a strong identity when it comes to my Asian heritage, and it evolved, which is, I'm sure, something Kamala Harris can relate to. Just saying.
Yeah, that's right about now.
Correct.
Where can people see 10 Times Better? Is it on the PBS webpage?
Not yet. I mean, we are working with one of our supporters, the Center for Asian American Media, to have a national broadcast on PBS, and that will happen sometime, hopefully in the next few months. But for the moment, it's on the film festival circuit. If you check our website, 10 Times Better Film, that's where we update people and on social media. But for your listeners in LA, we have a screening coming up at the Japanese American Museum. We have 2 screenings in San Francisco and one at the Reading Film Festival, which is October the 11th. So hopefully more, but stay tuned and follow us on social media, and we'll tell people what else is coming up.
Well, Jennifer Lin, thank you for being our guest again on the Musical Innertube. We always go places and really enjoy the ride. A wonderful short documentary, 10 Times Better. We're rooting for it to be seen by as many people as possible. And I can't wait for Beyond Yellowface.
Well, John and Don, thank you again for having me on. It's always a pleasure talking with both of you.
Thanks again, Jennifer.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Hey, let us know how we're doing. Send us an email at musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
Do you know someone with a great story to tell? Let us know. Send us an email or log in to our website, musicalinnertube.com, and click on the microphone in the lower right-hand corner to leave us a voicemail.
And while you're on our website, take a few minutes to listen to past episodes of the podcast. They're all there, along with pictures and biographies of our guests, blog posts, and lots more.
And as always, our thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for providing us with our theme music.